Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today, we're taking a look back at CPUs released in the past 4 to 5 years, specifically the AMD Ryzen 7 3700X and Intel Core i9-9900K, and there's a good reason why I chose those two CPUs, and it's not because we believe they were direct competitors, they absolutely weren't, but the reason will make more sense in an upcoming video that looks at upgrade paths. But before then, I thought a revisit that just looks at these two CPUs could be interesting. Now, upon release, you could argue that the Core i9-9900K competed with the Ryzen 7 2700X, though it's a bit like saying the Radeon RX 7900 XTX competes with the GeForce RTX 4090. The AMD offering, while still impressive, it is slower and as such does cost quite a bit less. The Core i9-9900K, for example, that launched with an MSRP of $600 US, while the 2700X came in at just $330 US, and then a year later it was replaced by the 3700X. So really, you could compare the 9900K with either the 2700X, which arrived 6 months earlier, or the 3700X, which turned up 9 months later. For this comparison, we've gone with the 3700X, and although it wasn't the most high-end Zen 2 based processor, it made the most sense for gamers, as the dual CCD 3900X and 3950X, they were more suited for productivity work. So based on the MSRPs, the Intel CPU costs a little over 80% more, though both did become much cheaper over time. The 3700X that dropped as low as $220, and the 9900K that made a brief appearance at $400. And there was also the KF model dropping down as low as $340, which was still a 55% premium over the Ryzen 7 part. Now, unfortunately, I didn't do as much CPU testing 4 to 5 years ago as I do now, so I don't have a detailed comparison between the 3700X and 9900K, though back in mid-2019 I did create a 36-game comparison between the 3900X and 9900K, which saw the Ryzen 9 part come in 6% slower overall. The data was based on 1080p testing using a GeForce RTX 2080 Ti, obviously using games that were available at the time. So in late 2023, with a much more powerful GPU in the RTX 4090, with a range of newly released titles, how does the 3700X and 9900K stack up? Both CPUs have been paired with dual-rank DDR4 3600CL14 memory, the latest BIOS revisions have been installed, and of course we are running Windows 11. So, let's get into it. Starting with Assassin's Creed Mirage, we find very competitive performance overall, as the 9900K was just 4% faster at 1080p. The 1440p and possibly even 4K data does look to be CPU limited, and again, performance between these two processors is much the same in this title, so a good result here for the much cheaper Ryzen 7 part. Things do look a bit different in Cyberpunk 2077 though. Here the 9900K is considerably faster, delivering 26 to 27% more performance at 1080p and 1440p before the data became heavily GPU limited at 4K. The 3700X is certainly delivering playable performance, but for those of you trying to achieve a high refresh rate experience, it'll be a struggle with the Ryzen processor. Granted, we are using an RTX 4090 here, but we're also using the Ultra preset, and when dropping the quality settings with a lesser GPU, the 3700X is still going to limit performance, certainly much more so than the Intel processor. Both CPUs are much more evenly matched in Horizon Zero Dawn. Here the Intel processor was 11 to 12% faster at 1080p and 1440p, and then once again we do become entirely GPU limited at 4K. Meaning both CPUs were able to maximize the performance of the RTX 4090. The Far Cry 6 results are also very competitive here. The 9900K was just 5% faster on average, and performance at 1080p and 1440p was heavily CPU limited with both processors, though interestingly, the 9900K was still superior at 4K. The F123 results are similar to what we saw in Cyberpunk. Here the 9900K offered significantly more performance, hitting 170 FPS at 1080p, making it 26% faster. And that margin was heavily reduced to 16% before being eliminated entirely at 4K, where the RTX 4090 did limit performance to just over 90 FPS. ACC is another title where the 9900K is able to deliver considerably more performance, and it's a title that's very demanding on the CPU, but not because it heavily utilizes the CPU, it's very much primary thread dependent, so it's all about that single core performance. And as a result, it is heavily CPU limited, and therefore we're seeing the same results across all three resolutions, and that being a 23% performance advantage favoring the Intel processor. The Watch Dogs Legion results are quite close. Here the 9900K was just 8% faster at 1080p, which is a reasonable margin, though not super impressive given it cost almost twice as much. We're also going to be hard pressed to tell the difference between 91 and 98 FPS at 1080p, and the 4% difference seen at 1440p is going to be next to impossible to spot. A Plague Tale Requiem is another modern title that favours the 9900K over the 3700X, and by a substantial margin. We're talking 21% here, and even at 4K, the Intel processor was still 17% faster. That is certainly a significant increase and a big win here for Intel. The 3700X also maxed out at 85 FPS in our Star Wars Jedi Survivor test, making the Intel processor 21 to 22% faster at 1080p and 1440p before the results became entirely GPU limited at 4K. And this is another example where the 3700X was able to deliver highly playable performance, but for a high refresh rate experience, the 9900K is far more suitable. The 9900K provided an additional 18% performance in Baldur's Gate 3, taking us from 80 FPS to 94 FPS, which again is a big increase in performance, but of course it came at a big cost. Now we see that although the 9900K does very well in Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, pushing almost 200 FPS at 1080p, the 3700X also does very well, and as a result the Intel CPU is just 7% faster, so this is a great title for the old Ryzen processor. Despite using the maximum quality preset, Resident Evil 4 is still heavily CPU limited even at 4K, using either the 3700X or 19900K. That said, the Intel CPU is still much faster, offering 16% more performance at the tested resolutions. For old time's sake, we've included Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and this title is very CPU limited even at 4K, as it arrived well before the RTX 4090's time. We're looking at up to 16% greater performance using the 9900K here, so a big performance uplift, though the 3700X makes out just fine with well over 100 FPS. It's a very similar situation in the Callisto Protocol. The 3700X is more than capable here, delivering over 150 FPS, yet despite that the 9900K was still 16% faster. So a good win for Intel, though if we look at this title in isolation, the performance you're getting from the Ryzen processor is more than good enough. The 3700X does very well in Total War Warhammer 3, allowing for just over 160 FPS at 1080p, and that meant the 9900K was just 7% faster. So fairly close results here, and of course, as is often the case, we're 100% GPU limited at 4K. Next up we have Hogwarts Legacy with ray tracing enabled, and here we are heavily CPU limited for all test configurations, limiting the RTX 4090's performance even at 4K. Still, the 9900K was 15% faster, so a decent uplift there. And it's a similar story in Starfield. In fact, it's the same story. CPU limited results across the board, with the Intel processor offering 15% more performance. The 9900K also enjoyed a 15% performance advantage in The Last of Us at 1080p, and then 9% at 1440p before we reached the limits of the RTX 4090 at 4K with 81 FPS on average. It is worth noting though that although the Intel processor was a good bit faster at 1080p, the 3700X still turned in an impressive performance with 99 FPS on average, so certainly very playable. The margins in Halo Infinite are also quite similar. Here the 9900K is 13 to 14% faster at 1080p and 1440p, and then just 5% faster at 4K. And it is again worth noting that the 3700X was able to drive over 130 FPS, so again, a very playable performance there. The Hitman 3 data is surprisingly competitive. The 9900K was just 5% faster, and all results here are CPU limited, even at 4K. So a good showing here for the Ryzen 7 processor. And last up we have Spider-Man Remastered, and here the 9900K was a massive 26% faster at 1080p and 21% faster at 1440p. And even at 4K, we're looking at a rather substantial 19% margin favouring the Intel processor. So while the 3700X certainly delivers playable performance, the experience with the 9900K is unquestionably better, especially if you have a high refresh rate monitor. Okay, so we've taken a look at the 21 games tested, and surprise, surprise, the much more expensive CPU was still faster. But how much faster overall? Well, let's take a look, and we'll start with the 1080p data. Here we see that the worst case for the 3700X was 21% slower, which is a massive margin, though it did cost 45% less. So in terms of value, the Ryzen 7 part still stands up pretty well. Moreover, on average, it was 13% slower, which again is quite a significant margin for the CPU to make. Then at 1440p, that margin does come down slightly to 12%, so very similar to what we saw at 1080p. There's just a single example though where the 3700X was 21% slower, though there were also 14 examples where it was slower by a 10% margin. Then finally, the 4K results. Here we're typically GPU limited, therefore the 3700X was just 6% slower, though we did still see margins of 10% or more in 8 of the games tested, so that is significant, though again we are using an RTX 4090 and realistically it's the lower resolution data that makes the most sense for this CPU testing. So which CPU was or is better? Which one should you have purchased? The Ryzen 7 3700X or the Core i9-9900K? It's an interesting comparison to look back on, and it is funny to think that these CPUs, they occupied so much focus of, well, they were the focus of so many online fights, let's say, between AMD and Intel fans. And as usual, what an epic waste of time that proved to be, because truth be told, they're both excellent and worthy of recommendation. And in fact, I did recommend both of these CPUs back in the day. During its prime, the 9900K was always recommended by us as the ultimate gaming CPU. A no-compromise type product for those seeking the best of the best is pretty much how we always put it. The 3700X, on the other hand, that was recommended for its excellent value. An affordable 8-core CPU with SMT support for 16 threads, offering unbeatable productivity performance at the $300 price point. Back then, I saw it as less of an AMD versus Intel battle, and rather I felt these CPUs really could have been made by the same company, despite the fact that they're in no way compatible. But what I mean by that is they really didn't compete with one another, largely because one cost $600 and the other around $300. Instead, the Core i5-9600K at $260 and the Core i7-9700K for $380, they were better priced to compete with the 3700X. Strictly for gaming, the i5s and i7s were very competitive, but if you planned on doing any kind of core-heavy productivity, they got rinsed by the 3700X. It would be interesting to go back and add the Core i5 to the data, so that might be something I do soon. Let me know if you're interested in seeing that. Now, unsurprisingly, 4 to 5 years later, the Core i9-9900K is still without question the superior gaming CPU, but that isn't to say the 3700X hasn't aged well. It's still very capable today, and had you bought it back in 2019 for just $330 US, I reckon you'd feel like you got your money's worth on that one, not to mention those who got one for around $200. When testing a range of mostly modern games using an RTX 4090 at 1080p, the 3700X was 13% slower on average, which, given its modest price tag, I think that's a really good result. Now, some will no doubt complain about the use of the RTX 4090, but I think that's a bit foolish to do so, particularly given the fact that in many new games, GPU performance was irrelevant, given how heavily CPU limited we were, even with the 9900K. Take the Starfield results as an example. Here, the 9900K was limited to just 61 FPS, and you can achieve the same level of performance with a Radeon RX 6800 XT. So whether or not we used the RTX 4090 or the 6800 XT, you would have received the exact same results. The faster 4090 just ensures that we're more likely to be looking at CPU performance across a wide range of games. Now, there was one game that did struggle on the 3700X, and that game being Hogwarts Legacy, though to be fair, it also was a bit of a struggle on the 9900K. Then there was Starfield, where the 3700X fell short of 60 FPS, while the 9900K just scraped by. So we are starting to see examples where the Ryzen 7 processor is no longer cutting it. But the good news for 3700X owners is that you can upgrade to the 5800X 3D at a relatively small cost. And of course, the upgrade is very easy, as you can just drop the CPU into your existing socket. And right now you can pick one up for just $320 US. And as I said, it will slot into and work on your existing motherboard. And chances are you've probably already done that. Sadly though, those rocking a 9900K, they'll have to purchase a new motherboard and likely new memory as well if they wish to make a real upgrade. Parts like the Core i5 13600K are pretty great value at $310 US, but you'll also need a motherboard, and decent Z790 motherboards start at $190 US. You'll also want some DDR5 memory to get the most out of that processor, so add about another $100 US for a decent 32GB kit. That's a pretty big investment for what will net you less than 10% more gaming performance than that of the 7800X 3D, and that's comparing 1080p performance using an RTX 4090. Of course, you can go with a DDR4 motherboard and keep your memory, and doing so would land you very similar gaming performance to that of the 5800X 3D. In short, if you were to initially purchase the 3700X and then later upgrade to a 5800X 3D, let's say a few years later, you'd have spent the same amount of money as someone who just bought the 9900K, which was the better gaming CPU to begin with. It's an interesting way of going about it, and I'm not sure which path was the best one to take, so in part 2, we will be adding the 5800X 3D to the data to see how it compares to the 9900K. That said, keep in mind, as I said earlier, these were two completely different products, or at least they occupied two very different price points. So most gamers probably weren't tossing up between a 3700X and a 9900K, but it's still interesting to look back at which option made the most financial sense, or arguably which made the most financial sense. So was it to go all in on the Core i9-9900K, or sort of play the upgrade game with AM4? I suspect there won't be a definitive answer because it'll depend on your sort of needs there, but I'm still keen to take a look anyway. And that is going to do it for this video. As I said, there will be a part 2 coming up on the channel probably next week, so make sure you subscribe for that. Like the video if you haven't done so already. And if you'd like to get more Hardware Unboxed goodness, maybe give us your 2 cents more privately or directly, then you can sign up to Float Plan or Patreon. This whole series was actually recommended or suggested to us on our Discord by a member. So thanks to them for that. I think it's a pretty interesting idea, and so far I've enjoyed the testing. But yeah, Float Plan Patreon, you will get access to our exclusive Discord server, monthly live streams, behind the scenes content, and Q&A stuff. So yeah, as I said, check it out if you're interested, but if not, that's perfectly fine. And I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you next time.